So good afternoon again, everyone, and thank you for all your input into that last session, which I think was really, really interesting, wasn't it, for everyone? And now we're moving on to the book series launch. This is a new concept in publishing for performers, designed for the needs of performer researchers and highlighting their strengths, particularly with regard to performance issues. I would like to elaborate on the concept and how it may be tailored towards performance and performance matters. I will look at my own proposal for the series. Not a word written on it yet, I have to say. But however, it's in gestation. And then David Mooney and Gabriela Meyer will present on their book projects, which are nearing completion at the moment and will be soon published. I approached publishers Peter Lang 2 years ago with the idea of devoting a series of monographs to various aspects of performance research in all its forms in Ireland. Based on a new and novel concept, each book features complementary audio-visual performance materials assembled by the authors on open access on the internet. As well as providing illustrations, these materials are intended to enhance the subject and content of the monograph and make it accessible for a general audience as well as a specialist academic one. They will also promote the book and vice versa. My own proposal is a companion to Moore's Irish Melodies, song by song. This centres around Ireland's national poet and songwriter, Thomas Moore, and his 124 drawing room songs known as the Irish Melodies. I have modelled the book on works such as the Schubert Song Companion by John Reid, where each of Schubert's 600 songs is discussed in detail. The book is aimed at performers, teachers, and those interested in Irish musical and cultural history. It is designed primarily as a reference guide based on the original publications by James and William Power in London and in Dublin. These were issued between 1808 and 1834, with musical arrangements and symphonies by Sir John Stevenson and Henry Rowley Bishop. The book will also include contributions by Dr. Mary Pearce with insights into Moore's detailed, very detailed, I may as well tell you, very detailed footnotes, which are like a whole book in themselves. The complementary audiovisuals will consist of demonstrations illustrating the more unusual aspects of Moore's songs, and complete performances will be mounted on YouTube. The book is motivated by the complete dearth of existing information on the Irish Melodies, particularly from a performative point of view. Teachers and performers of the Irish Melodies have often said that there's nothing out there to contextualise the songs or even to give a background to Moore's inspiration. It is a follow-on publication from my book exploring sources and style in Moore's Irish Melodies, and the companion recordings, My Gentle Harp, in the 6 CD box set, which was made in 2008, with performances of all of the songs sung by 21 young Irish singers. That research has led to an in-depth look at Moore's texts. These are, superficially at least, rather obscure. If you take a song like The Last Rose of Summer, which is clearly full of symbolism, but it's also rather nebulous, the one thing that is clear is that its motivation has little to do with a rose. The problem is that we no longer understand Moore's coded language, although it seems it was widely understood in his own time. If you compare Moore's text to the songbooks of the United Irishmen, the similarities are plain to see. So, contrary to popular belief, these are essentially political in nature. Yet, this perception of Moore as a lightweight, the famous "Tommy loves a lord" quotation, which perceives him as little more than an entertainer to the aristocracy, is quite simply absurd. Obviously, an understanding of Moore's texts in their fullest sense is key to a valid interpretation of the songs. And to contextualise Moore and his writings within his own time is one of the most important aspects that I want to address in the book. I've just published another work devoted to Moore, an annotated edition, the Thomas Moore Songbook. It's a co-publication between Peter Lang and Carysford Press, and I'm very grateful to TU Dublin for research funding towards this project. This new critical edition collects together for the first time selected original arrangements of the world-famous Irish melodies, along with foreign language settings of Moore's texts. It is a little known fact that Moore's songs were translated into almost every language and became a huge inspiration for a myriad of composers, including Schumann, Mendelssohn, Berlioz, and Dupac, whose songs feature in this edition. It was through Berlioz's settings of Moore's translated texts that the name for the French song, the Mélodie, came into being. Recordings of all the songs are available on Spotify and Apple Music with soprano Sinead Campbell-Wallace and tenor Andrew Gavin. I was just going to play you a beautiful song, the Élégie by Dupac, which is a translation of "Oh, Breathe Not His Name," intended as a tribute for the patriot Robert Emmet. This is a gorgeous performance, I think, from Sinead Campbell-Wallace, so I hope you enjoy. Returning to the book series and making a proposal, proposals are invited from individuals as single author monographs, co-authored books in collaborative partnerships, and multi-author works with individual chapters on a specific theme. The aim is to encompass all music performance research disciplines, including classical, jazz, Irish traditional music and world musics, conducting and composition, pedagogy and teaching methodologies. And there are surely others that may be added to that list. Partnerships between performers and musicologists or performers and composers are warmly invited, with both partners taking an active role in the research and development process. The word count, proposers should aim at providing a completed manuscript within the range 30,000 to 55,000 words, and all the proposals are peer-reviewed. Now, 30,000 words isn't a huge amount of words for a book. I mean, 100,000 or more would be quite normal, but in terms of the associated audiovisuals, I think that this is a method that will work for us. The audiovisual examples can take the form of an introduced performance of related repertoire, or a talk illustrated with performance examples or demonstrations designed to illuminate some aspect of the book. Proposals should include an abstract, an example of previous writing, and proposed audiovisual outputs. I was wondering, are there any questions, or is there anything I can illuminate for anyone with regard to making a proposal for the book?
It's wonderful, and it's great to see this taking shape. I'm just wondering with the name, Performance Research Ireland, that doesn't mean that this is exclusive to people in Ireland. So just wanted to
No.
make that clear.
And it's also not exclusive to members of Performance Research Ireland either.
Yeah. It would be nice to extend that invitation to submit proposals to people from outside of Ireland. It may not be clear just from the title, but just make it clear that it's more inclusive.
Yes, indeed, Denise. Thank you very much for clarifying that. I hadn't thought that it had seemed so narrow. Everybody understands that it has nothing to do with just, being Irish or, working in Ireland or whatever. The idea is to make it as international as possible, this whole process. And I do hope that people from abroad will consider making proposals as well. Okay. I'll move onwards now. Our two flagship publications are already well advanced, and I'm delighted to welcome Dr. David Mooney to present his book on the series, A Guide to the Songs of Poldovsky, and then Dr. Gabriela Meyer will present on her book, The Art of the Unspoken. But first, please welcome Dr. David Mooney.
While we're trying to find that, I'll just say good afternoon and thank you very much. And thanks to Una for the invitation. Great, that should start us off. Yes, this started off as a PhD project over 20 years ago. And I suppose, like most people, when you finish a PhD, when you recover yourself, you kind of think, really, I should try and get this published. And I never did. And one of the reasons was that I was never fully confident that the thesis as it was really interesting to people. It was on the complete works of Poldovsky, the complete published works. And there are works by piano, there are works for violin and clarinet. And while the quality of some of those works is a little bit uneven, the songs always stood out as being particularly good, and the songs are the works that are most performed. So when Una came along with this almost 20 years later, I couldn't believe my luck, and she said, would you think of doing something on Poldovsky? And I said, would it have to be the whole thing? She said, no, what about the songs? I thought, yeah, bingo, I have it. So Una, I owe you a huge debt of gratitude, because you're actually seeing a lifelong dream, believe it or not, come true, that I can finally do something about this wonderful music and this wonderful wonderful woman who deserves to be celebrated, a most fabulous composer who, unfortunately, like so many female composers, was getting lost in time and languishing in libraries, as you all know. So I'm sure, and like most people, when you hear the word Poldovsky, people say, who? Well, hopefully you'll know a little bit more by the time I'm finished. I don't think you can all see the screen, unfortunately, but I have a photograph of her there that was taken in 1920. Her dates are 1879 to 1932. And Poldovsky is the pseudonym of Lady Irene Dean Paul, who sort of formally before that would have been known as Irena Wieniawska. She was the youngest daughter of Wieniawski, the violinist and composer. So she's the only one of the 6 children who actually went into a career in music. And she was quite a force to be reckoned with in her day. She was born, just briefly, biography, I'll come back to this a little bit because there is quite a sort of important section in the book on the biography because there's nothing written very much about her. There are a few biographies on the internet, mostly actually taken from my biography in Grove, which is I'm quite happy about that. As long as more people know about her, I'm happy. But finally, I've been able to, over the 20 years, and I haven't been idle not publishing my PhD, I've actually been continually researching Poldovsky, simply because there are no living relatives, there are no unpublished scores. Almost everything is lost. There are no letters, there are no diaries, there is nothing. So this is a complete jigsaw puzzle, and I'm playing detective. But it's very, very enjoyable, and I know it will take me the rest of my life to even finish this. If it ever is, it probably won't be finished. But I'm hoping maybe in a few years, if I have more information, Peter Lang might let me do a bit of a revision, and we can have a little bit more information as it comes along. But it is quite a fascinating life story, and as many would say, worthy of a Hollywood mini blockbuster. This lady had some life. It's really quite, you'll have to wait and see the book. I won't bore you with it now, but it's good. It's pretty good, I have to say. Interesting character, very, very colourful. But the book itself has basically 4 chapters: a biography, a chapter on her dealing with poetry, and particularly the poetry of Verlaine, which was her predilection, and then 2 chapters on songs published 1901 to 1914, and then after the war, 1918 to 1928. And you'll notice they're songs published, not songs composed. I have no idea when any of these songs was actually written, but I only have publication dates. I can estimate basically when things were written by finding concert, details of concert performances, etc., and other references that tell me that things were composed before a certain date. But other than that, again, there's a lot of detective work taking place here. So if I just jump to chapters 3 and 4, because they're the bulk of the work. It's dealing with all of the published songs, and there are over almost 40 of them in total, many of them in French, because she was a devotee of Paul Verlaine, French symbolist poet, and some other French symbolists as well. And there are some English poets, and one Irish poet, Yeats, does feature once down by the Sally Gardens. I wish she had picked a better poem, but it's still great that it's there. She was actually part Irish. Her mother was of Irish extraction, and in fact a relative of Charles Alexander Osborne, who was Una's PhD thesis. So Una and I are cousins by PhD, as it happens. And and in fact, it was that slight connection that actually, in many ways, spurred us to kind of do a bit of work together. And we ended up at the Wieniawski conference in Poland a number of years ago, and we both gave our papers, which was really interesting to meet the people who are sort of Wieniawski nerds, as distinct from us who were other types of nerds. And we really enjoyed ourselves there. But anyway, just to get back to the songs, essentially, this is a guide really for pianists and singers. But it is not how to play the songs or how to sing the songs, because I'm not a singer. So I couldn't even begin to go there. But it is really to put the songs into context. It examines the poetry, in fairly good detail, and looks at the structure of the song vis-a-vis the structure of the poem, for example. How does she highlight the poem? How does she set the poem? How successful is it? Etc. And it also comments on stylistic developments as the songs go along, because there is a definite trajectory from early works right through to middle to late period works. That much I do know, and I can certainly place songs within a period, but I have absolutely no evidence to support the fact that song A was written in 1901 and song B was written definitely in 1928. But I can guess, I can do a certain amount of guesswork in that regard. So the chapter 2, which is on the poets themselves, really is an examination mostly of her relationship with Verlaine. And it's curious, there are so many parallels between her own life, which in many ways are quite tragic, and Verlaine's life, which was similarly tragic. And these sort of two artistic minds seem to meet. It's quite interesting when you read the two together. And she couldn't have known him really, because he died in 1896. So it's unlikely that they ever would have crossed paths. But he was a very, very popular poet and a real favourite of musicians, of composers. And one of the reasons for that is that he imbues a lot of his poetry with music. He was very much interested in music. And apart from the sort of direct references to music within the poems, titles like Barcarolle or Preludes or whatever, he actually inserts notes of solfège into the text sometimes. He has his characters sing. So, and then apart from all that, you've got this wonderful use of assonance and different types of rhyme that generates a sort of musicality in the poetry itself, and it makes it beautiful to speak. But of course, then, for a composer who's interested in French song, that's automatically a great attraction, because you've got something that's already sort of preformed as almost a little piece of music, and then you're going to add to it to make it into a performable piece of music. And that's, for me, one of the most exciting things about this, and the fact that she responds as a composer so well to this, considering that she's up against Fauré and Debussy, who are two of the major sort of setters, if you like, of Verlaine, and with very, very high quality works. And I have to say, I'm proud to say, as sort of somebody who champions this woman's music, that most of the settings do stand up to comparison. In fact, sometimes they're better. Just that little bit more sensitive to the words, some sensitive to an idea. Sometimes it's only one little sub-hint, subtext in the poem that she seems to seize upon, and she sets that very, very well, whereas maybe the other two composers maybe miss it or choose not to do it. Chapter 1, the biography, probably has given me the most pleasure because, as I said, she quite an extraordinary character. To be very brief, born in Brussels. Her father died about 9 months after she was born. He was concertizing around Europe, and he had been ill for some time, so she didn't know him. But her mother seems to have been quite a strong character. She had 6 small children to rear, and her own mother, the maternal grandmother, the Irish lady, Isabella Hampton, lived in London a lot of the time. So the family used to come from Brussels to London quite a bit, and they moved there permanently about 1896. So she met and married Sir Aubrey Dean Paul in 1901, and because of that she was immediately introduced into high society of London. He was a wealthy man for a while. Unfortunately, he made a few bad decisions and lost all his money, and she never forgave him. But and I would not like to have been him, because I'd say she made him suffer. But she had a performance career. She was a concert pianist. She was a performer of many of her own songs, sometimes singing them herself, which wasn't a good idea. Not, apparently, according to reviewers, not the most beautiful voice in the world. But she had access to so many other good musicians. Her father's legacy, being a Wieniawski, lots of people knew her. So doors were opened to her all around London, all around Europe. She had 3 children. The first died shortly after birth, second son, and then thereafter a daughter who eventually became very famous in her own right. And if I have time at the end, I'll tell you why. But she lived and worked in London very successfully. She knew everybody. She played in the Proms, for example, twice as a soloist with Henry Woods. And one of the occasions was one of her own works, a work called Ilan Hunna, which is based on an island off the coast of Scotland. She was this piano soloist in that work in 1914, conducted by Henry Wood in the Proms. But lots of evidence of performances, etc., combined with motherhood. But then financial ruin came. They had to sell their very, very nice house. They lived in a beautiful house in Basel Street, which, if you know London, is right next to Harrods. And when I went looking, I found this most beautiful street, and I was walking along, and I said, I have to find number 19. And then I come to where number 19 is a really ugly apartment block. And I was so devastated to find that the one house in the street that I really needed to see for myself was gone, you know. But anyway, such is life. She, out of dire necessity, had to go to the States and leave her children for 2 years, and she toured with actually her lesbian lover in the States, where they gave song recitals of Verlaine, and this other lady, Cecile Sartoris, used to recite the poems, and Irene used to play the piano as sort of background music, and then they would sing the songs. And there were multiple performances in the houses of the very wealthy around Boston, New York, etc. So she was very enterprising. She also set up a series of international concerts in New York, I feel she was, probably a very good businesswoman as well. And the first of these was given by none other than Rubinstein. So these are the sort of connections that she had. And she built up this sort of portfolio of being able to, function as a composer and also as a sort of concert promoter. Very, very gifted, I think, in many ways. And also, when things were really bad and she was back in London and had very, very little money, she took to dress design. And she used to design monogrammed pajamas for the Prince of Wales, believe it or not. And herself and the Marchioness of Carisbrooke, and this is the bit that really staggers me, set up a window cleaning business in 1928. Now, I'm not quite sure that they were up the ladders themselves, but certainly the very notion of two peeresses running a window cleaning business, I just think it's rather strange. However, the other part and the important part, as Una said about this, is the podcast. And this hasn't happened yet, but I have plenty of ideas for it. Certainly there will be performances of some of the songs, but to not replicate what's in the book, I think the sort of plans I'm toying with would be to do something thematic. So I'll choose a theme that is relevant to a number of settings and maybe examine that and be able to talk about it and illustrate at the piano and with the singer how she highlights, for example, images of dawn or dusk, which are often very prevalent in symbolist poetry because the whole notion of light, and we know how light affected the Impressionists, for example. Well, symbolist poets were similarly influenced by light, and a lot of the issues that you will find in Impressionism in the world of art, you'll find in the world of symbolism as well. So, this is another photograph of her in her early 40s. This one was taken in New York. And the little one over there, which you can't see, I'm so sorry it's so small, but I'm really indebted to actually a man that we met, Una and I met in Poland at that conference. And he sent me this afterwards. He said, I think I have a photograph of that composer you're talking about as a little girl. And that's her on the left as a 2-year-old. And it's an absolutely beautiful photograph. And I'm sorry you can't see it, but you can see actually, she hasn't changed much over the years. The face is almost exactly the same. So that was something I was really, really happy to find. So to finish off, I'm going to perform one song with you with Cathal McCabe. Cahill's the young tenor over there. He's in year 3 of the BMUS program at the Conservatoire where I work. And we're going to perform a short song by Baldowski called Spleen. And the title, just in case you're kind of intrigued by it, but the word spleen is something that it appears in late 19th century French literature. It means a state of melancholy, basically. And it is related to the organ of the body because it was believed that the spleen did kind of contain a lot of the negative energy of the body. And you'll find it in Baudelaire, for example. You'll find it in other French poets. They talk about spleen and this sense of ennui, which is a fancy name for boredom or whatever. But this song, as I said, is called Spleen, and I've just given you the text there and a translation for those who can actually see it. So I'd like you to welcome Cathal McCabe, who's going to join me to do that.
So, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Una, and thank you, David, for a very enjoyable presentation. So, I am delighted to have the opportunity to share my book with you today. And as this was going to be a whistle tour, I've actually have a lot of slides. I will rush through some of them, but hopefully you get a picture of how the book is structured and what it's all about. So my book is called The Art of the Unspoken, and it has to do with the idea of rhetoric, linguistic influences, and influence of the singing style. And the question that sparked my interest in researching this topic originally was very simple. I wanted to know what makes a performance memorable and how can meaning be conveyed without words, hence the unspoken. I set out to find out what expectations composers themselves had of music and what, if any, invisible traditions modern performers might have lost touch with when looking at classical and romantic music. The most important thing that I've learned is to recognize how closely music is related to language, first and foremost, in its purpose of communication. So, just to outline why and how I set out to do this, I investigated and traced three distinct aspects. The first was the influence of rhetoric, the second was dramatic and poetic elements, and the third was the model of the singing voice. This also led me to explore further the role of breathing, inflection, and gesture in performance. Many of the rules and aspirations of instrumental music are related to those of the spoken language. For example, the goal of music during the 18th century was to exercise some type of influence on the audience, to move the listener's emotions, to incite their imagination, to lead them to reflection, or simply to please their senses. So musicians strove to create music that would speak to the audience, and we still use this today to express music that actually touches us. The influence of non-musical elements such as literary subtexts, rhetorical principles, and dramatic narrative structure played a very important role in the context of aesthetic theories contemporary with composers like Mozart, Beethoven, Schubert, Schumann, and Liszt. Understanding the way composers and performers viewed expression, emotion, and ultimately communication is crucial to teaching how to perform these pieces today. This is also intrinsic to developing a sound world and stylistic delivery for different musical eras. And so my central position here is that rhetorical and linguistic connotations and use of singing style allow for a greater freedom in interpretation, as well as allowing us to develop drama and lyricism in performance. This is a beautiful quote from Heinrich Neuhaus, and again, it shows how the performers that became the pedagogues of the generations closer to us than those of composers still spoke about music in terms of language. So I won't read it there, you can read it, and I'll keep going. So chapter 1 discusses the relationship between instrumental music and language, emphasizing the dialogue between the arts and interactions among artists in the 18th and 19th centuries. The broad artistic heritage, out of which specific musical works materialized, holds the key to a better understanding of the aesthetic and spiritual context of those works. The spiritual dimension and the aesthetic value of music are related to the idea that music can convey meaning. The rise of instrumental music as a legitimate expressive art will be shown here in light of music's primordial relationship to language. The changing status of instrumental music within the artistic hierarchy and the evolution of aesthetic ideals in the 18th and 19th centuries created a climate in which solo piano music flourished. So in this chapter then I go on to explore the external influences of music and show how the rhetorical tradition is clearly linked with music from the earliest times. Originally, it was most apparent in music with lyrics, and the influence of the language led to nonverbal applications to instrumental music. Part of the historical context is the change of status of instrumental music in relation directly to how much meaning it was able to convey. So from this point of view, the most important part is that the music's capacity for meaning became higher as it was recognized that it could be expressive. And then eventually the difference in expressive capacity between vocal and instrumental music was one of degree, which changed during the Romantic time to mean that music had a higher status even than language because it was a universal language. So it transcended the boundaries of language. So in chapter 2 then, I reviewed the relevance of the rhetoric to wordless music, so to speak, and tracing the continuity of the rhetorical tradition. Then the most important part about the rhetorical approach as well is that it encourages performers not to think in a linear way of note after note or phrase after phrase, but rather on the architecture of purpose. So emphasis, articulation, surprise, and gesture work together to create a persuasive whole. And there I also traced the influence of Bach's music and also his sons in terms of conveying this tradition further through the pedagogical tradition. So the idea of a speaking or rhetorical principle, in German would have been Redendes Prinzip, underlined the tendency of borrowing the expressive vocabulary of the vocal music into instrumental music. So this again translates into making nonverbal music speak, and particularly the piano has such a wealth of repertoire and wealth of techniques that it's really showed this to the greatest extent. So chapter 3 shows the correlation between emotion and rhetorical figure, and this was explicit in vocal music and implicit in instrumental music. Recognizing the musical rhetorical figures starts to give us some tools for the expression that was understood at the time in terms of what the performers could do or were expected to know. For example, recognizing figures of emphasis can reinforce a performance instinct for projection. Similarly, understanding the purpose of abrupt, doubtful, or built-up figures allow a more convincing array of effects in performance. And so rhetorical influence is, in the first instance, most obvious in devices or figures whose use in music imitate their parallel purpose in language, but at the same time, the whole idea of having dramatic and poetical influences overlaps with that of rhetoric. So although they are discussed separately, they overlap in reality. So composers consciously employed the rhetorical figures and expected performers to recognize and apply them in performance. And there was a focus on expression all the time, and reference to rhetoric pervaded instrumental music. The other important change of aesthetic belief was from the universal nature to individual, and that also meant the performers were able to start imposing their own, were expected, as it happened, to add their own personality to the interpretation process. But as we move further and further away from that period, the respect for the musical score sometimes can get in the way, where performers feel like they can't necessarily follow their instincts as much because the music is sacred, as was said this morning. And so I'm hoping that this will be a guide that can give people the tools to have more freedom and to explore. So expressive declamation is, again, something that comes directly from rhetoric. And so Schubert and Schumann, they all refer to, there were a lot of, there's a lot in the chapter to show the connections between the composers and the performers. And also from the dramatic and poetical aspect, there's both influence on form and influence on content. Again, principles derived from rhetoric are woven together into piano music, and from drama we have the structure, we have the interaction, contrast, and transformation, and from rhetoric we have the structure, logic, and persuasion. As regards content, then again, The idea of character is very important. So character also translates into mood and atmosphere. So we always talk about this. There's a way of looking at it, about showing conflicting or changing emotions and diverse characters within the same piece. And also the idea there's maybe a parenthesis or different moods move to the foreground or the background. And so these are also very, very useful in terms of performance training. Chapter 5 then has to do with showing the influence of the singing style, and this is something very important to a lot of treatises and also to performance tradition. And an essential part of the ability of the piano music to convey meaning is by emulating the singing voice. Again, the influence of the vocal model is also translated to other instruments, but it's very, very important for piano. There's a desire to achieve vocal expressivity, and this, in fact, predates all technical developments of the piano. So we'll go back to C.P. Bach, and he also said about listening to singers if you want to know how to phrase well. So I have tried to show the connections between both the composers in their own words, as well as performance traditions, performance treatises, pedagogical writing, but also the writings of performers, and particularly the 20th century, to support the continuity of the model of the singing voice for pianists as a path to expressive performance. So the idea again is to connect unspoken narrative and dramatic and fluid musical architecture. Where again the musical image that's behind the score ends up influencing the gesture and the choice of technique as well. In Schumann's words, describing Liszt, which again I think is really interesting, the instrument blazes and sparkles in the hand of the master. It is no longer piano performance of this and that sort, but the aspect of a speech of a bold character. He triumphs over skill and the danger of the tool, and renders the serenity of art. So the speech of a bold character again refers to the linguistic parallel there. And so chapter 6 then, it's basically that following the practical use of the research in performance and teaching over the last number of years, I had some further thoughts on the practical applications of this concept in performance training. And a crucial aspect of this is that the balancing of respect towards the musical score, the historical performance tradition, and the need to bring a piece of music to life again today for a contemporary audience has to be essentially considered. And composers did expect performers to imbue the music with their own personality, but this is something that we must often reiterate for ourselves and for our students. The aim of this performance research was to inform modern performances and promote a greater understanding of an aesthetic framework that remains hidden in the current practice. And over the years, I also found that students often needed a broader pianistic context in which to explore some of these ideas. So then there is, I suppose, a wider pianistic framework that I use in my teaching that's informed by certain concepts. And they are this idea of reflective practice, clarity of intention, physical comfort, proactive mindset, and focus. And so those ideas together really fit in very well with communication and with following the phrasing and the breathing and the vocal model. Again, going back to some of the wonderful writing of C.P. Bach and Robert Schumann. Robert Schumann in particular wrote that I'm not yet in want of joy in my own heart, and that which people cannot give me, music gives me, and all lofty feelings which I cannot utter are spoken to me by the piano. Again, constant references to language, to the speaking power of instrumental music, of nonverbal music, which is pervades. And again, Brendel writing about Schnabel. So again, it's showing that this tradition has continued and is very much alive. And then finally, and in conclusion, just to say that the performers are the rhetorical link to the audience, and the awareness of these elements can contribute to a freer and more effective performance. Again, it is a matter of choice, and there is a wide range of ability, but in terms of proactive listening and active listening, I think it really helps students to go back and listen more intensely and communicate with this music from the past. And again, there's the parallel with language and meaning opens this path to greater understanding. So thank you. I was going to show a couple of examples. There's actually, I'm also developing a toolkit to go with this, and maybe I can show one of those. I'm not sure we're doing for time. Almost okay. And the idea was to have examples that would go with some of the diagrams, again, that could maybe be used for teaching and so forth. So just the singing style for Beethoven, one of the examples from Opus 10 number 3, the slow movement. They are almost on different parts of the stage, and it's very, very sudden. There's no transition really. And also the idea of doubt, this rhetorical figure called dubitatio, where things become more and more fragmented, and then there's a lot of silence. So the rhetorical silence is also a very important idea, but listening through the silence as if there's a continuation there all the time. Feel that tension and replicate it, even though it's